Hello and welcome to 15 Minute Theology, a podcast covering the central truths of the Christian faith in, 15 minutes. Let's call it that. My name is Tyler Burton, and I can't thank you enough for being here with us today. On today's episode, we are talking about God's infinity. Buzz Lightyear? No, God. What does it mean for God to be completely and entirely infinite? Is this a math equation or is this a theological proposition? Well, to help me out today is somebody who knows his theology, but also knows how to deal with all of these big ideas in really clear ways. Victor Gancedo is the student pastor at downtown Durham, Summit Church. I messed that entire thing up, but that's what you are. He's the pastor for students at Summit downtown Durham. He's a serial entrepreneur, a podcaster, and a YouTuber. He's also a good friend of mine and somebody who's been super encouraging during this whole podcasting process. So, Victor, welcome. Glad to have you here, man. What up, dude?
Thanks for having me on. You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm well, man. This is super exciting for me. You came on our concept episode.
I did. Yep, and mispronounced a lot of words.
But that's okay.
When we get to more than 5 syllables, it's tough. So theology is just, I don't know if I was built for the language of theology. You know what I mean?
Okay. That's okay. Student pastors aren't expected to use multiple syllables.
We're just meant to purchase absurd amount of food and things that the rest of the church is like, why did you need 5,000 bouncy balls? I don't know, but we did.
You did, and that's really all that matters. Dude, thanks for coming on here, man. We've known each other for a long time, and we've sat in many classrooms together. We've sat in many coffee shops together talking about big ideas and trying to figure out what do we do with them. And we've even talked about dogs together as we hear a pup in the background.
He gets mad when people are outside.
I don't blame him. We've had a lot of these conversations, and I want to be able to bring that conversation into now just a recorded space for other people to hear, because you're able to bring such great context to things. So infinity.
Yeah.
Let's just start really quickly with the definition. Yeah. So when we say God is infinite, what are we saying? What do we mean by that?
When we say God is infinite, it's literally that God is not finite. He cannot be constrained by any one thing. And so I think of it in 3 different areas, right? It's God's omniscience, God's omnipotence, God's omnipresence. Those things do a really good job at helping our finite mind understand the infinity of God.
Yeah, and those things, omnipresence, God's everywhere. Omniscience, he knows everything. And then omnipotence, if I could say it. See, now I'm the one that's pronouncing, and it's my podcast.
Gotcha.
Omnipotence. So he's all powerful, right? We had John Hammett on the podcast, and John Hammett, who was our theology professor at Southeastern, and I had him talk about those 3 aspects specifically, and only he can do 3 doctrines in 15 minutes. And at the end of it, he actually said, Tyler, there's a 4th one you're missing, and it's omnibenevolence, and that he's all good. So it's not just that he upholds everything, it's that he's entirely good while he's doing it.
Yeah. That's such an important caveat too, right?
It is.
Because if those 3 things were true, doesn't necessarily mean that God has our good in mind or has good in mind, right?
Right.
So this omnibenevolence,
nice job.
That is such a key piece to this, and really helps put into perspective the other 3, especially for our finite brains.
I agree. And so infinity necessarily leads to the omnis, but when we're saying that he's infinite, what implications does that have? Let's unpack that a little bit further.
Yeah, I think of Ephesians 1. We often think of infinity as a time thing, and just a time thing alone. That's where eternality and infinity get kind of confusing. They all play into one another, but they're 2 very distinct things. But it's God is not just infinite via timeline, right? He's infinite in all these other things. And so in Ephesians 1:4, it talks about how God chose us in love before the foundation of the world. And it's okay, so before anything existed, from eternal past, right? Eternity past, God knew us. But God was also infinitely powerful enough to also choose us. And so you see his infinity play out not just in time, but also in power and presence. It's man, who are we to to like be known by the God of the universe from eternal past. Like that is something that like I struggle with, and probably for the rest of my life will struggle with understanding like how much God has to love me to do that.
Yeah. That's such a great point, because any conversation about infinity, I automatically recognize how finite I am.
Yeah.
It's just my comparison to him is right away. And that's what we see in the scriptures all the time, is that when God's infinity is being extolled, it's at the expense of human creatureliness. And I think of our God is in the heavens, that he does all that he pleases. That's in the context of the weakness of humanity. Yeah, absolutely. So then, okay, so God is above everything, over everything, strong enough for everything. He's everywhere. How do we not get on the slippery slope to pantheism?
Yeah.
When we talk about infinity, because pantheism is that he's everything, right? That like
literally
God,
anything or everything could be a God.
Right. Like, so how do we not kind of slip into this Christian pantheism in all of this as we're thinking through?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important question to ask, because we see like throughout church history, this has actually been a slippery slope that people have gone down. And there's an important distinction to note that like God is, yes, over and in everything, but because he is the sole creator of the universe, that all of those things are also in him.
Yeah.
So it's like God encompasses the entirety of his creation. And so although like, yes, he is over and in everything, like those things are also placed under like subject to the one God. And so those are important distinctions. And again, our finite brains, it's very difficult to comprehend this, but God in his grace and God in his mercy has given us what we need to parse a lot of these things out. Because if he didn't, we'd be so lost.
We'd be in trouble. Yeah. We'd be in massive trouble.
Yeah.
That's such a helpful thing to bring up, the creature creator distinction, right? Like he upholds the creature, like you were saying, yet he's not the creature. He's the creator of it. That's such a helpful way to think, like to not fall into error. That's so good.
Yeah. It keeps me from thinking that like I am God, right? And it's like, it keeps me from thinking, it's like, this is such an incredibly important thing for us to understand, because it keeps us not only from like having these unintentional, like minor heresies, like keeps us from knowing who God of the universe is. Like this is fundamental to his character. Yeah.
So I'm curious along those lines then. So the Bible not only communicates about who God is, but also that somehow, some way I can know this God and be known by this God.
Yeah.
And yet I am a creature, right? Like we were just identifying, there's a massive gulf between his complete infiniteness and my small finiteness. There's a massive difference between us.
Yeah.
How can we possibly be known by this infinite God?
Yeah, this is where like I get so pumped up, because this is where just like the beauty of God comes into full display for me. It's like the only way that we get to be known by God is because he has allowed it to be that way. It's like God in his infiniteness has given us the opportunity to step into relationship with him. And it's only because God chose that is made available to us. So like, yes, Ephesians 1:4, like from eternity past, like he chose to know us in love. It's like, because he chose to know us in love, do we then have the opportunity to step into this relationship with Jesus? But literally there is no way that in our finiteness that we should have any concept of who God is or what he's done, unless that God has revealed it to us. And we see that throughout the Old Testament, especially, right? Like God is constantly revealing himself to his people at the right time. And even after God is constantly revealing himself to his people, we see that like in our finiteness is like we are so quick to forget to remember what God has accomplished for his people. And it's like, man, we have crazy limitations, and it's only because he's made himself known to us that we get to have any, like, even just know that he exists, let alone like have a relationship with him.
It's almost like too beautiful to talk about, in a sense. Like you have to talk about it, but I was just listening to you, and I didn't really have much afterwards you were talking, because I know I have another question to ask, and I've got to keep a conversation going. But I kind of just want to sit and think on that and be wowed by that the infinite one becomes finite. And like you mentioned, in the person of Jesus, became finite unto death, so that we finite ones could be with the infinite one.
And it's like, I just actually had like the opportunity to preach on this, but it's like he became finite and he experienced the things that like you and I experience. So it's like, Jesus experienced the emotional toil of having friends deny him. Jesus experienced like the struggles of losing a friend, and like Jesus weeps, right? Like Jesus has walked through the same things that like we have walked through to the nth degree. And it's like, who are we for the God of the universe to even consider suffering so that we could know him? It's just like the only tangible response to that for the Christian is to fall down and worship. Like there's no other response to that. It's like words will never do it justice.
Yeah. And I'm thinking on what you said earlier, that there is a sense in which approaching this God, you can feel like, how on earth can this happen? And I think that's a good awe that comes up, because while we may not be able to know this God fully, there is still that creature creator distinction between us. We can know him truly. He can be known to us as much as we are able to know him. And then we will spend eternity doing just that. Knowing and being known by him. You touched on it a little bit in your last answer, but how then does God's infinity go then to the Christian life? Yeah.
It's like, the Christian life isn't possible without God's infinity. Life in general is not possible without God's infinity.
Yeah.
And we want to talk about like some common graces that like just humanity has in general. God's infinity is one of them, because we would not exist if it weren't for his breath that spoke this world into this universe into existence. And so at a very practical level, like the fact that you and I are here recording this podcast, having this conversation, the fact that like humanity exists in the way that it does is simply because God chose it to be that way. If God wasn't infinite, he wouldn't be God. And so that's like the base. But it also has crazy implications for the believer. It's like the thing that keeps me in awe of Jesus. There's a lot, but a lot of it starts at his infinity, because if it weren't for this thing, if it weren't for God's infinity, then there's no reason, there's no way that I would be able to have a right relationship with him. And so at the core, it's like, man, the gospel is able to exist and have the power that it does because God is infinite.
Man.
And that is what should drive every Christian to like the knees of Jesus. And I find myself in the Christian life in seasons of prayerlessness, or in seasons where I'm finding it difficult to worship. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I have lost the proper view of who God is and how big he is. It's like the hatred of my sin. Like I hate my sin more because I see God as bigger. And I can only hate my sin if I view God as big. If I have a small view of God, I probably have a pretty lenient view of sin. And so I don't know, there's a lot there, but the core of this just causes me to worship.
Man, that's so good, dude. That was awesome. That was incredible. I think the thing that you just made me think of was the scene from, I think it's Prince Caspian in the Narnia novels, where Lucy sees Aslan and she goes, "Aslan, you're bigger."
Yeah.
And he goes, "It's not that I'm bigger, it's that actually you've grown. And because you've grown, you're able to see me more correctly." Yeah. So that's such a great like touch to even how we grow as a Christian.
For sure.
We grow as a Christian by seeing his infinity. Well, Victor, this has been awesome. Thanks to you once again on 15 Minute Theology. Thank you for joining me as well. We will see you next time. Look forward to talking again soon.